not only was God inviting me to the priesthood, but he was also inviting me to religious life, to join community life. And it wasn't just any particular community. It was one community, one order of men, the Oblates of the Virgin Mary. A question that every seminarian gets asked, myself included, multiple times throughout their time in formation is, when did you hear Jesus calling you to the priesthood? Like, when did you hear his voice? Or when did you receive your calling? It's a question I've been asked multiple times. It always makes me laugh and smile, if not externally, definitely internally, because honestly, it's not a question that I really enjoy answering. Not because I don't like to tell my story, but I don't know what it is. It's a difficult question to ask. It's a very personal question. Just like when a husband and wife are asked, how did you first meet? Tell me about that. You can tell it, but there's a personal element that it's hard to describe. That no matter how you describe it, you can't adequately talk about that moment because there's a relationship there between you and God, myself and God, and it's ultimately his work, and it's a mystery. I can't say there's one moment as I look back at the entirety of my life where I can say, God, it was because of that moment called me to the priesthood. I can look back at my life now, and I've had plenty of opportunities in these past 8 years in my time of formation as an oblate seminarian to reflect on the entirety of my life. And I can see throughout my childhood, throughout my teenage years and young adult years, till I did discover of my vocation, that God was calling me to the priesthood, that God was calling me to the Oblates of the Virgin Mary. For example, I can look back to being a 7th grader, an 8th grader at St. Francis Holy Ghost Catholic Grade School in Jerseyville, Illinois. And I can remember when the priest, Father Gibbons, would come to the classroom and he would talk to us. And I can remember in those moments when he would come, I would just kind of look at him and I'd ask myself that question, could I be a priest? Is that something that I could see myself doing? And it's not like I ever said I want to do that with my life. But there is definitely a subtle, I think so. I could do that. I can look at being an altar server as a child growing up. My family, we were cradle Catholics. We were in church every Saturday. We went to church usually whenever my dad was lecturing on Saturday nights. And then when I was old enough to altar serve, it was based on when I was serving. So Saturday nights or Sunday mornings. And I loved being an altar server growing up. I can't describe it at that time. I wasn't really consciously aware of it, but I knew that I loved being in the sanctuary. I knew that I loved being close to the altar where the sacrifice of the Mass was actually taking place. And it was just a very good, innocent, pure time period of my life. When I can definitively say, though, that I heard that voice, or when I experienced that call, was definitely in June of 2011, July 2011, when I went to Cursillo for the very first time. If you've never been to Cursillo, the best way to describe it is it's like a 3 or 4 day retreat-like experience where you just focus on Christ. You focus on God and see, where is God at in my life? And you work on that relationship with him. Going into that time, Curcio in 2011, I did not want to be there. I did not want to go. I was living life well. from a moral standpoint. But for a year, my sister, older sister Katie, and her husband, Brian, had been asking me to go to Curcio, and I always said no. It was a solid no. I don't need that. I'm good. I'm content with where I'm at in life. And finally, I said yes, mainly just to get them off my back. And I had every intent of not going on this 4-day retreat-like experience. But I didn't back out. They drove me up to Quincy, Illinois, about 2.5 hours north of Jerseyville. And when I got there, I was so mad. And I stayed like that for the first couple of days. I remember getting out of the car and walking into the building, the complex we were at, and I turned around and they pulled out this, like I call like religious Curcio paraphernalia, these like name tags and necklaces with a crucifix on them. And I just remember looking at them and saying, this is a setup. Like, you guys have set me up. And I just became very upset and angry. Eventually, over the course of those 3 or 4 days, that anger subsided. Christ broke through. He broke through in a big way and pierced my heart. And I realized during those 3 or 4 days, first of all, that I needed to just change the way that I was living my life. Before I even thought of the priesthood, before that even came to me, I realized that my life was all about me. A big event in my life happened when I was 18 years old. I had just started my freshman year of college, and my dad passed away suddenly. We weren't prepared for it. There's no way, even if you do know, you can prepare for a moment like that in your life. And for me, it was devastating. But the negative side of it was that for a period of probably 5 or 6 years, the most important person in my life was me. I did a lot of good things. I found a career, like I said, as a nurse and helped people, and I wanted to save lives. But overall, life was about me. It was about Paul Kallal. And I realized at Curcio that second day, that Friday evening, Saturday morning, that life was all about me. And I had to change that no matter what happened with the rest of my life. And then the second big breakthrough that weekend came that evening when I cried for the first time in probably 5 or 6 years. I just remember walking through this crowd of people. It was like walking through heaven. All the lights were off in the church. Everyone had a candle. And it was like being in heaven. And I saw my older sister again. I was totally surprised when I wasn't expecting them to be there. And I remember her and I just hugging and embracing one another. And I broke down. And really, what I know now is that it was just a huge moment of God's consolation just coming into my heart and giving me the gift of tears. The next morning, on that Sunday morning, as we're back in our room where all these talks were taking place, we're with our groups and all the other men there on that retreat weekend for Curcio, we were asked to just be silent and to stare at this picture of Christ. And I will always remember and see and have this picture in my life. It's just an image of Christ smiling. And no matter where you're sitting at in the room, his eyes are focused on you. His smile is directed towards you. It's a very beautiful and amazing photo. But it's not coincidence, it's a God instance that I was sitting right in front of this photo of Christ smiling on us. And as the silence took place and I was staring at that photo, I don't know what it was. It wasn't like a voice. It was just something from within, deep within, in the recesses of my heart, that I knew Christ was asking me to become a priest. And I silently said to myself, Lord, are you asking me to be a priest? I think you just asked me that. But then as soon as I realized that and asked that question, the next statement was do you know who you're talking to right now? I'm sure there's a lot of better candidates out there for that position. The beautiful part of that moment was that it became a thought, it became an idea that was never in the forefront of my mind at all times. The beauty of God in that moment was that he asked, he invited, but then he left me alone. He allowed me to leave that weekend and to work on rebuilding relationships with my family, of finding contentment in life with my job, with bodybuilding, and just working on being me, and returning to the church, returning to Mass, returning to the confessional. And for the first time in my life, as I started living for others and not myself, I became content and I had true peace. Eventually, though, that idea, that thought of the priesthood continued to come back. And there are two real powerful moments that I experienced God calling me to the priesthood, and not just having an idea and rejecting it, but actually accepting the invitation. And both of those moments came through my job as a nurse, where I started to realize that God wasn't just calling me to save lives, he was calling me to save souls. There was one night in the ICU, cardiothoracic ICU that I was working in, that my patient wasn't doing well. There were a few doctors in the room and one or two other nurses, and we were starting to do, pretty extreme life-saving measures. And I remember giving a medicine to this person through the IV. And I was standing there and I look at the monitor to see if the patient's numbers are coming up. And I remember just looking at that monitor and knowing and having this thought that you're not calling me to this. You're calling me to something more. And that more is the priesthood. And I accepted it. A few months go by, and it's coming back a little bit, but nothing really concrete. And it came again by taking care of a young man who was, he was a little bit younger than I was, and I was 25 at that time. And this young man had a normal life. He was perfectly healthy. And then with the blink of an eye, literally, he never woke up again. And he came into our ICU, and for 2 weeks I helped take care of him. And I just saw this young, healthy young man deteriorate. And it was through taking care of him and watching him that I realized definitively that this is not what God was calling me to. And after another night of taking care of him, and when the realization came that it was time for him to leave Earth, like it was time for his family to let go. His mom and dad came into the room that morning before I left, and I was updating them. And I had to have that conversation that I have had numerous times before with other family members. It's an uncomfortable conversation, but it's necessary. And I just looked at them and talked to them and said, it's time to let go, if you're willing. I left, came back to work that next night, and found out that morning they had let go, that they had let their son pass away. But when I left through those doors to the ICU that day, I knew definitively that God was not calling me to just nurse people, to nurse their body, that he was calling me to nurse the soul, and to do that as a priest for Jesus Christ.